Welcome to part one of a two-part series on the Mundell-Fleming model. The Mundell-Fleming model is one of the most powerful frameworks in international macroeconomics. It extends the basic ISLM model, the workhorse model of closed economy macroeconomics, to a world with international trade and international capital flows. It tells us how monetary policy, fiscal policy, and exchange rate policy interact in a small open economy. And it explains why countries with different exchange rate regimes face fundamentally different policy options. The model is named after two economists, Robert Mundell of Canada, who later won the Nobel Prize, and Marcus Fleming of the United Kingdom. Working independently in the early 1960s, they realized that the ISLM framework needed to be extended to handle the realities of the international economy. The model they built remains the foundation of every modern textbook on open economy macroeconomics. To understand the Mundell-Fleming model, you first have to understand the concept of a small open economy. A small open economy is one that is small relative to the world economy. It can trade goods with the rest of the world. It can borrow and lend in international capital markets. But it is too small to affect global prices, global interest rates, or global demand. Israel, Switzerland, Denmark, Singapore, Australia. These are textbook examples of small open economies. The key implication of being small is this. The world interest rate, call it R star, is a given. It is set by the global market. The small open economy takes R star as a constant. Domestic policy decisions in our small economy cannot meaningfully move R star. This is the central simplifying assumption of the Mundell-Fleming model. Now let's review what we are extending. The classic ISLM model has two equations. The IS curve describes equilibrium in the goods market. Investment equals saving, output equals planned spending. The IS curve slopes downward in the interest rate, output plane. Higher interest rates discourage investment, so output falls. The LM curve describes equilibrium in the money market. Money supply equals money demand. The LM curve slopes upward. Higher output requires more money for transactions, so the equilibrium interest rate rises. The intersection of IS and LM gives us the equilibrium combination of output and interest rate in a closed economy. This is the framework Keynes built, that Hicks formalized, that every macroeconomics student learns by heart. The Mundell-Fleming contribution is to ask, what happens when this economy can borrow and lend internationally? When capital can flow in and out across borders? To answer that, Mundell and Fleming added a third element to the diagram. The world interest rate, R star, drawn as a horizontal line. The position of this horizontal line relative to where IS and LM intersect tells us everything about the economy's situation. If IS and LM intersect at a domestic interest rate higher than R star, foreign capital wants to flow in. If they intersect at a domestic interest rate below R star, domestic capital wants to flow out. What happens next depends on a single critical variable, the degree of capital mobility. This is the spectrum that defines the Mundell-Fleming model. At one extreme, perfect capital mobility. Capital can flow instantly and costlessly across borders. At the other extreme, zero capital mobility. The country's capital account is closed. Capital cannot move at all. Under perfect capital mobility, the result is dramatic. The domestic interest rate must equal R star at all times. Why? Because any difference creates infinite arbitrage opportunities. If R exceeds R star, capital floods in. The capital inflow increases the money supply or appreciates the currency under a flexible exchange rate. Either way, the system adjusts until R equals R star again. Conversely, if R is below R star, capital flees. The system adjusts in the opposite direction. In the ISLM R star diagram, this means that under perfect capital mobility, the equilibrium must lie on the horizontal R star line. Either the LM curve must adjust to make this true, if the central bank is willing to let the money supply move, or the exchange rate must adjust to shift the IS curve. The model becomes a tool for analyzing how these adjustments happen and what kinds of policies remain effective. Under no capital mobility, the analysis is completely different. The country is financially isolated. The domestic interest rate is set entirely by domestic IS and LM, with no influence from R* at all. The R* line is drawn on the diagram, but it is informational only. It doesn't bind anything. Domestic monetary and fiscal policies operate exactly as in a closed economy. This is the situation Israel was in for parts of its early history, and it is the focus of part 2 of our series. Most real economies sit somewhere between these two extremes. Imperfect capital mobility. Capital can flow, but not instantly, not costlessly, and not in unlimited quantities. Most emerging markets and many advanced economies during periods of financial repression fall into this middle zone. In the Mundell-Fleming model, this is represented by a BP curve, a balance of payments curve, that slopes upward but is neither vertical nor horizontal. The slope of the BP curve depends on how mobile capital is. So the basic structure of the Mundell-Fleming framework comes down to 3 elements: IS curve, LM curve, the world interest rate R*, and on top of these 3, the assumption about capital mobility, perfect, zero, or somewhere in between. From this small set of ingredients, the model produces extraordinarily rich predictions about how fiscal and monetary policy work in an open economy. Now let's take a simple example. Suppose the government wants to stimulate the economy. It launches a fiscal expansion, more spending or lower taxes. The IS curve shifts to the right. In a closed economy, this would raise both output and the domestic interest rate. What happens in our small open economy depends crucially on the capital mobility assumption. Under perfect capital mobility with a floating exchange rate, the fiscal expansion is largely ineffective. As IS shifts right, the domestic interest rate momentarily rises above R*. Capital floods in. The currency appreciates. The appreciation makes exports more expensive and imports cheaper. Net exports fall. The IS curve gets pushed back to the left, almost all the way back. The net effect on output is small. This is the famous result that under perfect capital mobility and a floating exchange rate, fiscal policy is weak. Under perfect capital mobility with a fixed exchange rate, the same fiscal expansion is highly effective. As IS shifts right and capital tries to flow in, the central bank must buy foreign currency and sell domestic currency to defend the fixed rate. The money supply expands. The LM curve shifts right. The interest rate stays at R*. Output rises substantially. This is the opposite result. Fiscal policy is powerful when the exchange rate is fixed and capital is mobile. Now consider monetary policy. The central bank expands the money supply. The LM curve shifts right. In a closed economy, this would lower the domestic interest rate and raise output. What happens in the open economy? Under perfect capital mobility with a floating exchange rate, monetary expansion is very effective. As LM shifts right, the interest rate dips below R*. Capital flows out. The currency depreciates. The depreciation makes exports cheaper and imports more expensive. Net exports rise. The IS curve also shifts right. Output rises by even more than the original monetary expansion would have suggested. This is sometimes called the exchange rate channel of monetary policy. Under perfect capital mobility with a fixed exchange rate, monetary expansion is impossible, or rather, it is immediately neutralized. As LM shifts right and capital flees, the central bank must intervene to defend the fixed rate. It sells foreign currency and buys back the domestic currency. The money supply contracts. LM shifts back. The economy returns to where it started. The central bank cannot independently set the money supply when defending a fixed exchange rate with open capital markets. This is the deep insight of the Impossible Trinity that Mundell himself articulated. These results form the policy menu of the modern Mundell-Fleming framework. Under floating rates with mobile capital, monetary policy works and fiscal policy doesn't. Under fixed rates with mobile capital, fiscal policy works and monetary policy doesn't. The choice of exchange rate regime determines which policy instrument the central bank gets to use. This is one of the most important policy lessons in all of macroeconomics. The case of no capital mobility, the focus of part 2 of our series, is different again. With the capital account closed, the small open economy behaves much more like a closed economy. Both fiscal and monetary policy can affect domestic output and the domestic interest rate. The exchange rate regime is less binding. The central bank has more degrees of freedom, but this independence comes at the cost of being shut off from international capital markets. For most modern economies, that cost is now considered too high. But for the post-war Israeli economy, for the Bretton Woods era globally, and for many emerging markets even today, the no capital mobility analysis is the appropriate framework. In part 2 of this series, we will work through the ISLM open economy model in the no capital mobility case step by step. We will see how the IS curve shifts under fiscal expansion, how the LM curve shifts under monetary expansion, how the exchange rate adjusts under different regimes. And we will see why Mundell-Fleming, despite being more than 60 years old, remains the essential framework for understanding modern macroeconomic policy. If this introduction is helping you understand how exchange rate policy and capital flows interact, please share the video with someone who would benefit from it. And subscribe to Macroeconomics with Michael for Part 2, where we go deeper into the model's specific predictions and policy implications.